Another place where you're going to find some amazing diversity in these prokaryotic creatures is in the different ways basically that they eat or get energy. So Concept 27.3 is all about the diverse nutritional and metabolic adaptations that have evolved in these prokaryotic creatures. Prokaryotes can basically be categorized on how they obtain energy and carbon. Of course, they need energy to do the various life functions, and they're going to need carbon as the basic ingredient for building more of themselves. So we basically have four different categories here. We have phototrophs, which obtain energy from light. Chemotrophs obtain energy from chemicals, and then as far as the carbon, we have autotrophs, which require nothing but CO2 from the air as a carbon source, and heterotrophs, which require organic nutrients to make other organic compounds. Now, if you kind of scale this up to large, say, animals and that type of thing, or plants and animals that we're more familiar with, think about the way these words are used. And if you're talking about science vocabulary, it's very helpful to study the prefixes and suffixes and the root words. Troph, T-R-O-P-H, has to do with nutrients or nutrition. Photo has to do with light. So a phototroph is basically a creature who gets its nutrition or can obtain some of its energy from light. So like, for example, in the larger land, plant and animal world, a plant is a phototroph. Compare that to like a human or a dog, you would call them a chemotroph. They have to obtain their energy from chemicals. So a phototroph would be more like a plant, a chemotroph would be more like an animal. Now, how about the carbon? Well, in the larger world that we can see with our eyes, a plant would be an autotroph. It contains or needs only the carbon that it can use from the air around it, the CO2. And an animal would be a heterotroph. It has to eat other organic nutrients to make its organic compounds. So if you wanted to combine the two, you could say a plant is a photoautotroph and an animal is a chemoheterotroph. And think about this, but scale it down to the tiny little prokaryotic creatures we're talking about, and that's another way of kind of subdividing them based on how they get their energy and how they get their basic supply of carbon that they need to live. So if you mix and match these terms, you can basically come up with four different methods of nutrition depending on how they get their energy and carbon. You can have photoautotrophy, chemoautotrophy, photoheterotrophy, and chemoheterotrophy. Your book in table 27.1 kind of lists all these various nutritional modes out and kind of talks about where you might see some examples. So like, for example, a photoautotroph, this gives you an example, and the best example for us might be the photosynthetic prokaryotes, plants, of course. Those would probably be good examples. So a plant is a photoautotroph. Going back to like animals like you and me and elephants and zebras, that would be a chemoheterotroph. So a photoautotroph would be like a land plant, and a chemoheterotroph would be like a land animal or just an animal in general. Now these other two are a little bit more odd. A chemoautotroph and a photoheterotroph, you don't really see those except in the prokaryotic world. So these two are more only in the various prokaryotes, some of which we're going to look at over the next this chapter, and some of the other creatures that are not prokaryotic but are small eukaryotic creatures, we'll look at them as well. So these two, photoautotroph and chemoheterotroph, are more common, and we see those just walking around East Texas. But the chemoautotrophs and the photoheterotrophs are two categories that are less common, and they're usually only with the prokaryotic creatures. So these are four different nutritional modes, and it's another way of kind of sorting out these creatures based on how they live. Another way to sort them is how they deal with oxygen, because some of these prokaryotic creatures need oxygen and some of them need to stay away from oxygen. So if they need oxygen, if they require it for cellular respiration, they're called an obligate anaerobe. Obligate aerobe. So an obligate aerobe is something that requires oxygen for cellular respiration. An obligate anaerobe is poisoned by oxygen and stays away from it. Instead of using cellular respiration, they use fermentation or anaerobic respiration. So an obligate aerobe has to have the O2, an obligate anaerobe has to stay away from the O2. And then, believe it or not, there are some creatures that can flip-flop between those two aspects depending on their environmental conditions. Those are called facultative anaerobes. Facultative anaerobes can survive with or without oxygen depending on the situation. We can also look at how these prokaryotic creatures deal with another element, nitrogen. Nitrogen is very essential to the metabolism of most living creatures. It's essential for the production of amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. It's also essential for the building of nucleic acids, which go on to build the DNA that's so important to all living creatures. Prokaryotes can metabolize nitrogen in a wide variety of ways, and they're actually much better as far as the diversity of nitrogen, the forms, the many different forms that they can use. Eukaryotic creatures can really only use certain forms of nitrogen, but many prokaryotes can use a wider variety of types of nitrogen compounds. There's actually something very important, especially in agriculture, called nitrogen fixation, where some prokaryotes can take the nitrogen that you find in the air around you, atmospheric nitrogen, which is just N2, and they can convert it to a form called ammonia, which is NH3, and then that ammonia can be converted by other creatures and plants into usable nitrogen. So a plant can't just pull nitrogen from the air the way it can pull carbon from the air. It has to get its nitrogen usually through the soil, but it has to be in a certain form, and oftentimes it takes prokaryotes to get that nitrogen into the correct form that then the plants can use. One last thing for us to look at is something called metabolic cooperation. Sometimes prokaryotes, even though they are unicellular creatures, they work together. So you may have colonies or groups of them kind of work together because they can accomplish things together that the one single cell cannot all by itself. And they can make better use of maybe some resources that they have in their environment. A good example is a cyanobacterium. Cyanobacteria are photosynthetic. They can produce energy using sunlight. There's one type of cyanobacterium called Anabaena. Anabaena has two different things that it can do. It can do photosynthesis, or it can fix nitrogen. But the problem is one cell can't do both jobs. In every one of these bacteria cells, they have the genetics to do either one of these jobs, but one cell can't do both jobs at the same time. So what they do is they actually form these long chains, these long colonies, and they work together. Most of the cells will do photosynthesis, but some of the cells in the colony will do the nitrogen fixation. These nitrogen fixing cells are called heterocysts or heterocytes, and they basically share these materials between the photosynthetic cells and the nitrogen fixing cells. So they work together and they form these long filamentous chains of cooperative cells. And it's almost like this is a very primitive form of multicellular life. It's thought that perhaps this is the way that multicellular life first began, where these single cell creatures began to cooperate and work together for the benefit of them all. Here's a picture actually of this particular prokaryote doing this. So you have these are individual cells, these are individual creatures, but they connect to one another and they live together and they work together. Most of them are doing photosynthesis, but you see these odd shaped ones, these are the heterocysts. They are fixing the nitrogen and they share materials all up and down the chain. So again, this is metabolic cooperation. Probably this is the method that eventually developed into multicellular creatures. One last good example of this metabolic cooperation is in the formation of something called biofilms. A lot of these prokaryotic creatures and bacteria form these sticky films that connect them together and connect them to the substrate that they're on. So biofilms are very common in nature, and they form when you have this cooperative group of individual prokaryotic cells all working together. They signal one another, they share resources, they cooperate to bring in nutrition, they cooperate to get rid of waste out of the colony. So they're really acting as one organism, but they're made up of individual separate cells, but they're all stuck together and working together. A good example of this you can find every single morning when you first wake up and you know you got that horrible morning breath, and you reach up and run your finger over your teeth, or you run your tongue across your teeth, and if you take your fingernail and you scrape your teeth, you might even get kind of a yellow gunk film material on the top of your teeth before you go to brush them. That is a bacterial biofilm. That bacteria is forming a colony inside your mouth, living off of the leftover food and gunk and dead cells that are in your mouth. So the reason you want to go brush your teeth every morning is to break up that biofilm and stop that colony from forming. Yuck!